Hello, and welcome to a new vision for Catechesis. I am so glad that you joined us today for this webinar. There have been about 500 of you from around the world that have registered for this. I want to especially say hello to our friends in Canada. I did not have a space on the registration form for their province, and I heard from a few of you that will be on there next time. Welcome from Saskatoon and British Columbia and from Quebec and Calgary. So glad that you're with us today. We've got two of my favorite people in the world to work with in this space of parish renewal and creating growing, thriving parishes, and that's Julianne Stanz and Dr. Stephen Serafin. Those who are watching that don't know both of you, could you just tell us more about who you are and what you're doing? Julianne, if you would go first.
Yeah, I'm currently the Outreach Director for Evangelization and Discipleship for Loyola Press, a role I've been in since January of this year, which is wonderful. It allows me to go out across the world speaking and building relationships. Before that, I served for 16 years as Diocesan Director in various ministries, and I continue to serve as a consultant for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. The most important thing about me, though, is I'm a mom and I have three mostly wonderful children, depending on the day.
You do. And if you follow Julianne on social media, you'll learn about her family and her children and what happens when you put purple carrots into Irish stew. It's pretty amazing. Stephen, tell us about yourself.
I'll have to check that out. So I'll start with the family. I have a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old, and we just did family photos 2 days ago. That was a very, very interesting experience. And so we got some good ones, but I would say 95% of them were not the best, but it was great. I actually just took on a new role this past July. I'm the executive director of Faith and Family Life Catholic Ministries. It's a newer apostolate. It came out of sort of the COVID time. And we're really looking at trying to come up with a catechumenal approach to formation, heavily on adult focused, but also family focused. And so it's walking people through this new approach that the bishops have been calling for the past few years on. And we actually make intentional formation that is a journey that puts families through a process. So I've been doing that. I'm also a practitioner. I still work at a parish at St. Vincent's in Madison, where we're going to try to execute this model this year. But I've been using this the Pathways Suite for the last 3 years at St. Bartholomew's in Scotch Plains, New Jersey.
Well, great. Well, I know that both of you have worked in parish life. You're not just speaking about this from a distance. You've been practitioners, and I'm so excited that you're both on this because, first of all, just the topic at hand are things that I know both of you care deeply about, and it's been a part of your life for a long time. And you've also, this is so much something you embody that the USCCB reached out to both of you and said, help us learn how to do this better, help guide us. And so who better to have on this webinar than you two? So when we talk about this new vision for catechesis, which is really, I mean, it's a term I came up with, but it really is, if we look at an old way of things and a new way of things, for many people in the church, this is a new vision. Why don't we start with what the old vision or the old version stereotypically might have been? Just feel free, whichever one of you wants to jump into that question.
Yeah, I think this is a great place to start because I'm just scrolling through the list of names here and I recognize diocesan directors, parish folk, people in the world of faith formation. I recognize discipleship directors here. And so I think it's a great conversation to have that this brings everybody together. We know the issues with formation that is very programmatic, non-relational, information driven, and really models a school based model rather than a discipleship apprenticeship model. And so I want to say to folks that are out there and wondering what's new, what's different, start with how you might have received catechesis or how your friends. And I remember I got a call from a parish. I went out to visit them and they were saying, the materials that we're using are just not working. And I went out and I looked at the approach. They were still using a similar school-based model from the 1970s with similar resources, in 2018, 2019. young people have changed, the context of our lives have changed. Cultural Catholicism is no longer the dominant modality of transmitting the faith. And so I think those are some of the areas that we have to really look at and ask ourselves some hard questions around what has really changed in how we're evangelizing, catechizing people today. And I know, Dr. Stephen, you've talked about this many times as well. We've shared conversation actually with John about this. So I'd love to hear what you think the past looks like. And I don't want to demonize the past either. There's some great takeaways there, but we have to do things different today.
Yeah, one of the things I like to say, because I'd say I'm still a baby when it comes to formation, right? Like, so I've been doing it maybe for about 15 years, but there are people who have dedicated their lives to doing this, right? And they've been trying to be creative and come up with different ways. But I always like to say that, like, the old way, we had a recipe that didn't have all the ingredients that were necessary. And throughout all the church's writings over the last few decades now, they've been sort of putting those pieces together. And I think we're finally in a place where that is. But where I feel like in the past, where we've been focused is really more on sort of the conformity and the transmission of sort of like the doctrines of our faith, right? So that's what they wanted to get clear. And so back in like 1997, they created the actual protocols of how you would actually go through and hit. There was about over 300 of them that you would hit that would connect directly to the catechism. And so they wanted to make sure the actual things that we were handing on were correct, like the teachings that were being handed on. So they looked at it through the lens of authenticity and completeness, that they were getting a whole thing. That's the completeness, like the whole understanding of the catechism. But then how it was being translated was being translated in a way that kept the authenticity. So even if you're talking to a younger child, they were still getting key cores of the faith, which there's nothing wrong with that. The idea of understanding and making sure that the faith is transmitted correctly, that's needed. But I think an overemphasis was placed on that. And then we had the structures of the schools there, right? The buildings were there. It was easy to be able to plug in this process of catechesis formation into that system because it was just present for us. So we could just get books, put them in classrooms, and go. And for some time, that might have been effective because there was also this at-home component where families were practitioners of the faith. It was infused into the day-to-day. But the reality is too, like, you can go back 2 to 3 decades, that also still wasn't happening in some families. And so what I think we had this intention of, okay, let's make sure we're handing on fullness of our faith, but we didn't think about the practice of how do we implement that? How do we take what we're learning, the knowledge of who Jesus is, and then really implement the why we do this, and then the who we're doing it for. And so I do feel like now the church has come to a place, and I am very excited about this because Julianne and I were both out in Chicago when they released the new handbook for catechetical accompaniment. And my favorite thing about that was that diocesan directors were there, bishops were there, publishers were there, even people at local parishes were there, and everyone was in a uniform agreement that we all want to move forward in the same way, right? Like we want to engage with more tangible resources, more intentionality. And now the question is, okay, now how do we get to that next step? How do we move with creating new tools so that diocesan leaders and local parish leaders can now implement this new approach?
Yeah, if you'd allow me to pick up on that too, I think Dr. Stephen said it really well. I think you can tell how to tell if you still have a programmatic mindset in your faith is often if your catechists are focusing on the what and the how of faith, which is important. But if it's disconnected from the who and the why, you're going to run into difficulty because the who and the why of our faith, the personal encounter with Jesus Christ, has been neglected a lot of times, actually. And we have catechized people without evangelized, right? And so many Catholics cannot tell you the basic gospel story. I think that this is so key. I remember having a moment at a conference where a sister came up to me, a sister, and she said, I've been a sister for over 50 years. I've gone through catechesis. I went to Catholic schools. I went to Catholic university. And today you asked a question that I couldn't answer, which is, who is Jesus Christ to me? And so at the heart of evangelizing catechesis is intimacy with Jesus Christ. That is the aim. So that's a quote right out of the New Directory. So if the aim of your program is not complete intimacy with Jesus Christ, you have to ask yourself then, what are you doing? Because many times we're passing on faith like this, the faith. How many times have you heard people say the faith? Like it is like a manual that you pass on instead of a living relationship. And so a living relationship today is going to look very different because of cross pressure coming in on the culture and the pressures that we're finding. It's harder to be Catholic today. It's harder to live your values, particularly in public, on social media. And so faith formation that prepares young people to witness to their faith in everyday life, that's the current emphasis with this whole dynamic of evangelizing catechesis. You said that beautifully, Stephen.
Julianne, I like what you included there, because I think when we ask people to witness to their faith, often people don't have a story of witness. They can give information, but they're not the woman at the well. They can't run to their friends and say, you've got to meet this man I just met, right? And I think we have to start by asking ourselves, what do we want the end product to be? If our end goal is people who are filled with information and can regurgitate it, then maybe the old model worked if people would agree to it. But if our end goal is transformed lives of people that are loving God and loving their neighbor and exuding the fruit of the Spirit, well, then you have a different process to get to that goal. And I think that is what we all hope to see. How would you describe this new process, this new vision? And, you know, Stephen, as you and I've talked about, it's not really a new vision, it's an old vision, right?
One of the passages I go back to continuously, and I speak about this a lot, is that, as you said, right, it's not a brand new vision. It's just reinterpreting sort of the story that we see in the road to Emmaus in present day, right? And in current day, the realities that we're facing. And so Jesus gives us the core of how to accompany another person in faith. And so and then the road to Emmaus is a perfect example of the catechumenal model that most of us are familiar with in the OCIA process, the RCIA-OCIA process. But a lot of people don't realize how to disengage that process and then put it into other types of formation, right? And so Pope Francis is very clear that the catechumenal method to formation is like the key method for formation. So he's using it in every different aspect. But if you just look at, just very quickly, if you look at the road to Emmaus story, you have these two apostles who are walking away from Jerusalem, right? And what is in Jerusalem? The church is in Jerusalem, right? They're hiding in the upper room. They are, they're afraid, they're nervous, but these two apostles are walking away. They're going to Emmaus, and this stranger that they don't recognize comes alongside them. We know that that's Christ, but Jesus just listens. He hears their stories. He hears their anxieties, their worries. These two people had put their whole faith into who Christ and Jesus was, and now they were lost. And they even heard inklings that the resurrection happened, but they didn't believe it, or they didn't understand. So how often are we facing those people, right? We have baptized Catholics, we have people who have all their sacraments, but they're really not engaged with who Jesus is, right? They're blind to seeing him in their everyday life. And so he just listens to them. And then after he gets their story and understands their human experience, then he introduces them to the scriptures, right? But what's important about that is where he is present in the scriptures. So they didn't have the New Testament at the time, so he's going through the salvation history and making the connections of where he's at. And that's the good news, right? That's the kerygma he's trying to reshare with them. Then they keep walking, or he keeps walking on that journey. They've been inspired by that share of the kerygma, the good news, and they invite him into their home, right? And so I think sometimes we miss that they invite Jesus into their home to stay with them, to abide with them, to be with them. And it's only after they invite them into their home that they have a meal and that Eucharistic sort of conversion, that big aha moment takes place. And they see Christ present in their life. And what do? They run right back to the church. So Christ gives us this methodology, and then we use that as this way of walking with people. But I think we need to realize that there's some key components to that message of this idea of that home component, right? The understanding of the gospel, as Julianne said, that are foundational to proper formation. And then the other one is beginning with that human experience. So human experience, kerygma, home participation, or lived faith, I think are key to this new approach.
Yeah, and just picking up on that, Dr. Stephen, John, I love that you asked the question the way that you did around the value of witness. Because in the older directory for catechesis, the 6 tasks of catechesis were very clear. And I'm sure many people that are listening and are here with us know those very well. They're knowledge of the faith, moral formation, liturgical formation, formation in the life of community, teaching people to pray and live out a life of service. What's really interesting about the new directory, so when we're talking about the new directory here, let's just slow down a minute and remind ourselves. The new directory came out in the summer of 2020. It's 4 years old. So we're still unpacking this, and I really appreciate that Ellen has just dropped that link here. The very, very interesting thing is if you read those 2 directories together, and I'm a little bit of a document nerd around evangelizing catechesis, and you intersperse them, what you're going to notice is the very, very first task of catechesis is what, John, you just asked about, which is witness. Witness of life before all the other tasks of catechesis take place. And you are correct, John. Many Catholics say, I don't have a story of faith. Nothing remarkable has happened to me. And, I think it's tempting to look at the Emmaus story and to focus on, the fact that the disciples walking along were really talking about an extraordinary event. They were chattering and gossiping about what was happening in the next town over, right? And it was remarkable, but many Catholics do not think they have a story of faith, and they do. Catechists need to be absolutely convicted of their own personal relationship with the Lord and be able to witness to that credibly, courageously, and with clarity for young people today. And then I would say the piece around witness and the kerygma is especially important. Kerygma comes from the Greek word to proclaim or herald. It is to give witness to the person, right? And I think many times, and I'm guilty of this myself, we'll often talk about my relationship with the church. And that language can feel very foreign to young people because we don't really have relationships with institutions. We have relationships with communities and people. And yes, we have a relationship with the universal church and the institution of the church, but oftentimes that took precedence over this more personal witness-based understanding. And so for those that are listening in, if you have a team of catechists and you're like, okay, I'm exactly where we are. This is reaffirming where we're going in our parish or our diocese. But if I was to say now, I want you to turn to the person who's next to you and tell them how you were introduced to Jesus Christ and what he is doing in your life today, then you'd see people clam up and say, well, that's private, right? And you have to reframe that for catechists. Faith is personal. It's not meant to be kept private. This is the value of witness. So I think this emphasis on witness in the new directory is just very, very powerful. For those that are listening, I would really encourage you to read the preface and the introductory chapter that talks about the value of witness, because it does so in such a beautiful way.
Yeah, Julianne, when I work with parishes in this space of evangelization and we talk about this topic of sharing our faith or witnessing it can get really awkward. And then I ask people, okay, let's just stop that conversation. How many of you experienced a product that changed your life and you told all your friends about it? Well, they raised their hands. I'm like, what was it? And they're like, well, it was the magic eraser. They're incredible. Have you seen this thing? Have you tried it? It was the Roomba vacuum cleaner. Oh my gosh. And I said, you told your friends about it? Yes. Yeah, I loved it. I said, were you pressured to do that? Did Roomba send you through a program to teach you how to tell other people about it? And they begin to realize, oh, when you encounter something and you recognize what it is and how it affects your life, it's natural to tell other people about it. And we need to make it more natural, right, to talk about Jesus. When we look at this new directory, I think there are kind of 5 steps that it highlights if we boil the whole thing down. Can we talk about those 5 steps? Just guide us through them kind of succinctly.
Sure. As Julianne talks about, right, the first one and the key to everything that we believe in, and right, the church has said this since catechesis tradendae, right? So we have a deep and personal encounter with the person of Jesus Christ, right? That's got to be the first and fundamental one, and then that encounter is then empowered by the Holy Spirit, right? And so we believe that we have this intimate relationship with Christ, and that the Spirit is at work daily in our lives, and that we are able to continue to grow that. Then I would say that the second one is to proclaim the be able to proclaim, or well, he first receive and then proclaim the gospel and the kerygma. The third is to accompany people in a response through faith and conversion to Christ. The fourth is to do this within an understanding of God's revelation, but then within the community of the Catholic Church. And then the first is this idea of missionary discipleship, right? That you have these steps that are leading you into a deeper relationship with Christ. You know the gospel. You're able to be accompanied in this response of faith, but then you're sent and you're meant to share that with other people.
Julianne, you have a story that you share about accompaniment that to me was just such a great picture. Do you know which one I'm talking about?
The bike?
The bike. Because when people say, accompaniment has become this word that everybody uses, but nobody really knows what they mean exactly. But I felt like this picture that you shared to me was like such a picture of accompaniment. Could you share that with everybody?
Yeah, and it's so interesting because I was with the parish team yesterday and they were talking about buzzwords in the church. And, we talked about charismatic proclamation, missionary discipleship, evangelizing catechesis in the first 5 minutes of this conversation. Let's take a pause, I said to the group yesterday, and I put up the quote on the art of accompaniment, which comes from Evangelii Gaudium, which is the 2013 Post-Synodal Apostolic Exhortation, is the full title of that document. It's called The Joy of the Gospel, and it has this beautiful quote. It says, "The church will have to initiate everyone, bishops, priests, and laity, into this art of accompaniment, which teaches us to remove our sandals before the sacred ground of the other." And one of the priests who was there said to me, "Where does that quote come from, this idea of the sacred ground of the other?" It's actually from Exodus. And it says, "Remove your sandals, for you stand upon holy ground." And I think that's the beginning of our efforts at accompaniment, which is the person that we're walking and journeying with is not other as separate, but we journey as brothers and sisters in Christ. I think we sometimes talk about catechesis like people are deficient and we have to fill them up with all this information, like they haven't met Jesus. And I think opening their eyes to who Jesus is in their lives is really important. So back to that story, John. I was really grappling with this understanding of accompaniment as it's an art, it's not a science. And so it's going to look very, very different. And how you form your catechist in this understanding is going to have this very nuanced flair, if you will. But I was trying to teach my son how to ride a bike, and he was not getting it. And I know parents who are on this call will totally resonate, but you're like, you do everything. You get on the bike. You're cycling the bike with the child. Like, here's how the pedals work. Watch how my legs go round and round. And you go along and then, you put the child on the bike and you tell them, here's how it works. And you give them the mechanics of the bike and forward momentum. And then you kind of actually, at one point I realized I was actually pedaling for my son. I was kneeling down and I was moving his feet. And after a couple of moments, it was like something clicked for him. But in order for him then to develop the balance, I started running with him holding the bike. And I was like, "I'm going to let you go." He's like, "You better not, Mom." But I was running. And then after a few moments, I stepped back. And so to me, this was a great understanding of the art of accompaniment. He fell on me. I fell on him. We had skin knees. We had bruises. There were tears during this. But at the end of it, he was like, "Yeah, I have this video of him. I can do it myself, Mom." But I thought, for all of that to happen for him, I had to get my hands dirty. I had to get on the bike myself. I had to move his little legs. And I thought, this is a great reminder for us about the art of accompaniment. It cannot be a one and done, a once a week endeavor. We have to be present in, as I say in my quote behind me, the thin, messy places of where God is at work in people's lives. That's where the art of accompaniment is holy ground for us. And so I think catechists, because they're out in our parishes and catechetical leaders, can be in those spaces of accompaniment. So to me, I love that you remember that story, John, because to me it emphasizes just how much of this is messy and unplanned, and it can be intentional too. So I would encourage people not to shy away from accompanying people, even if it's difficult.
If I could quote you again to yourself, which is a little strange, but it's just stood out to me so much. You said that The method or the model of accompaniment is relationship, and that the currency of relationship is time. And I would say time and presence, right? Like that's where relationship happens. Um, Earlier, you alluded to that catechists need to become comfortable with their own story, with talking about their own story, and helping guide other people in discerning their story and kind of, oh, I have encountered Christ. You know, you're helping me see that I have encountered Christ. Um, the elephant in the room, or what I would say is the hardest part of this entire thing that we're talking about, is that I would say most people on this call are totally on board with what we're discussing, and they're excited about this idea. They're super excited that the USCCB is now on board and really guiding us in this direction. But we have a lot of catechists who have not been formed in this way or this methodology or mindset, and we can be on board on a leadership level, but if the people delivering the experience are not, it could be a real problem. I would say it's not going to happen the way that we hope it would happen. So how do we address that in our parishes? Because I would say that's what I see as being the biggest hurdle moving forward, is addressing that challenge.
Go ahead, Dr. Steve, and I see you taking a pause there.
I think
You guys don't fight over it, okay?
Julianne,
Because I know you've
What-
got great wisdom here.
it's building off of what Julianne was saying, though. I really think that we need to infuse more intentionality and give some of our time to all of our leaders from the top down. I think the bishops need to spend more time with their key leaders in the diocese. I think that the diocesan leaders, we need to spend more time with our parish catechetical leaders, not just teaching, but also creating these experiences where we can witness, where we can build relationship. And then it trickles down that way. But I think no matter where you're at, I think where can I spend being more intentional with the people that I'm serving? What I have found in doing this, it is the greatest part about our ministry, right? And I think it's the thing we desire the most in doing this, because you get to. I always someone always says always. I heard this. I've heard this a lot. Is that you don't always get to see the fruit that you plant, right? But I think that one reason we don't get to do that as well is that we're not in the mess with them from time to time. So where we can dive in and really meet them and hear their story and get to know who they are so that we can best serve them, right? And so what Julianne was saying about the bike riding, we can't really know best way to hand on the faith of somebody if we don't know the things that they're struggling with, right? The things that they're wrestling with, the areas where they feel maybe inadequate, or they feel that or where those roadblocks might be. And so the more we can infuse that intentionality, where we take that time. And so I had Father Ed Leahy, who's the president of Benedictine High School here in Newark, New Jersey. He gave us a retreat, and he used the burning bush moments, and he said that he challenged us. He said, how often do you have burning bush moments that you're so busy that you just disregard, you don't realize, right? So it's that family who's passing you on that Sunday who might need a little bit of your time, where you can dive into a conversation with them. For my first experience, we had that retreat, and then we went on to I was teaching at a high school at that time, and I had this kid who just kept popping his head into the classroom, and I was like, what is he doing? And then randomly, after like the third time, I was like, Anthony, like, what's going on? And he eventually came in, and he was really going through some tough stuff. But sometimes I think when we're going through the busyness and we have all the things we need to get done, it's so hard to maybe take that time to take that intentionality. But I think as ministers, we really need to, and leaders of faith, we really need to just pause and make that a key component of what we're doing on a weekly basis.
Yeah, I agree with this. And I think there's an individual who asked the question about how do you form catechists well? And I think witness, like WITH, witness, being together, and witness go together. And so I really encourage diocesan and parish leaders to spend a lot of time reflecting on this question. You know, where's your mission field? And for a lot of catechists, let's just start with, for example, a lot of pastors, because I know we've got some on the line today with us listening in. A lot of pastors will say my mission field are my parishioners and, and outside the walls of the church. Your first mission field as a pastor are your parish staff, because together you can mobilize quickly for the mission field. For catechetical leaders, we spend a lot of time talking about children, but as a catechetical leader, my first mission field were my catechists. And so noticing the rhythm of catechist lives, like who's celebrating a birthday, knowing that, they're struggling and dropping off a meal. This person is celebrating the birth of a grandchild. This is, in order for us to do discipleship well, the way that Jesus wants us to do it, you cannot outsource discipleship. You have to do it together. And so for pastors, I would encourage you to work together as a team, to disciple, to pray together, to share vision. For catechetical leaders, that should be happening with your catechist first, so that they can understand how to translate that into a classroom. So witness is absolutely critical, and looking at your mission field. The other thing that I would say is that something that we said earlier, I just got a little private message for someone, so I want to acknowledge this. There's a lot of people who are feeling discouraged as catechetical leaders or diocesan leaders who've been in ministry a long time, and are saying, my goal was always to put people in touch with Jesus. And now I'm hearing a lot of doom and gloom around, it didn't work. I think we have to be very, very careful to recognize the great heritage and legacy that we have in our traditions, our communities in the past. And then I think we have to find a way to conserve those traditions that are beautiful and can be used today, but we have to liberate them in a way to bring them alive to fresh eyes and fresh ears for young people. We have to recognize too, young people cannot sit for a complete hour of conversation. The synapses in their brain have been completely changed by social media. We know this developmentally. And so how we teach today is really, really important in terms of how to engage with their lives, how to listen attentively to their questions, how to reframe those questions in the light of the gospel, and then to send them back out into a world feeling more hopeful and renewed in faith. I think those are some of the elements of witness that we need to connect more deeply for people.
Yeah, Julianne, I was just with a group of priests in Rockford, Illinois yesterday. We were talking about this very thing, caring for staff and volunteers. And one thing we really focused on is that your staff is your first flock, right? And for staff, your volunteers are your first flock. And lastly, that people will do for others what you have done for them. Mm-hmm. That you have to model it for them. You have to care about them and for them, and more than just what they're going to do for you. You have to connect with them. And I read this quote recently that really resonated with me. It's David Augsburger. He says, "Being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they are almost indistinguishable."
Wow.
And how many of our people, whether it be volunteers or parishioners, have first felt heard and seen and known by us before we move into here's what you need to do, or here's the information you need to understand. And I think when we start with that, we're really teaching them this is what it means to be human. This is what it means to know a person and to accompany them, to walk with them in life. I have another tough question, because I think if we ignore these questions, we really can't fully help people. What would you recommend for those situations where we have these people that have been taught that it is a transfer of information? They've been doing it much of their life, and now we're telling them, wait, we're doing something totally different. And it's a tough transition for them. And I'm speaking of catechists. How would you suggest we navigate that with those people?
Yeah. Dr. Stephen, do you want to jump in? I'll follow you.
Yeah. And then just also to build off of what you were saying as well, I think one of the things that, as we're pitching this new approach and trying to go back to this model of accompaniment and it more trying to be intentional, I think it's important to say that work, and I think we said this in the beginning, that people have tirelessly been trying to do this in creative ways and in different, very effective ways. The only reason I'm here is that there are people who witnessed and multiple people who witnessed and then accompanied me along my journey. I think the big thing that's missing is that we've learned and developed the culture is different. So there's the people that we're serving are different, but then also we've learned that adults learn differently, right? Like, and we're now bringing in that type of adult learning methodology into our resources, into how we approach things. I think also the we also understand the importance of this home component because of all the data that's out there, that we're trying to focus more on, like, how do we bring faith into the home, into the everyday life. And so what I find is important, because I think the catechist question is also there, is that there are catechists who have been doing this for a long time. So I think I even got it when I was trying to do my first approach here, is that they said that I've been doing this before you were even born, which is true, right? They've been doing this for that long. But I think it goes back to this idea of sharing in this charisma with them, in the story of the gospel with them, and beginning to pull out that witness and trying to, from that way of sharing faith with them, I think becomes the way that they start to see a more open approach to this. I feel like there is a lot of discouragement that's out there. So how do we lift up these faith leaders who are there to be able to be re-inspired or given that vigor again to share that faith if it's dwindled at all? But I would say the more we can intentionally support that group, it will then help in that transition into this more intentional approach, because you can only accompany a few, but if you can start with that few, then and then commission them to accompany the next group. I think that's where we have to go. And you might not be able to do the masses right away. So it might be a smaller approach as you go.
Yeah, this is a great conversation point, because this is the reality that many parishes find themselves in, and all of us do, actually. And so I think we have to acknowledge that there were ways in which we formed people that were effective for the time that we live in that no longer are as effective. And I think part of good leadership is being attentive to the mourning and the grieving that sometimes we feel that we're not equipped to reach young people today. And so just take a pause and recognize that for some people, this is hard news. And then to lean into the gospel message, which is the new hope and the new life that comes with Jesus Christ, in a culture today that is marginalizing him in so many different ways. And then to remind catechists that the first disciples that Jesus chose were ordinary men and women who were living lives of complete abandonment and surrender to him. And their witness as catechists, as echoes of the church, is heroic and exceptional in a culture of passivity. And so if you can sit with, maybe Margaret, who's been a catechist for 20 years, and affirm the good that has happened, and to cast vision for this new approach, not as the church is asking us to do this, that is true, but as this is Jesus's methodology. This is how Jesus built disciples. This is how the early church functioned. We have learned, because of the way that we're living today, that we have to go back and recover a sense of what Jesus did and what he asked us to do. And I find that when you help people understand Jesus's methodology of forming disciples, the first thing it is, he prayed for the disciples, right? He prayed about who to choose. Simple way to do that in your classroom is, when you get that class list for the first time, run your eye down through every name and pray for every child before they come into your classroom. Pray for their families, pray for the Lord to be with them. Simple. And then model Jesus's process of formation, which is people encountered him. They came to him, come and see, be with him. And then they decided to follow him after that encounter. And then they were formed in community. And then they were sent out on mission. So if you're wondering why Dr. Stephen and John asked that question about those pillars in the directory, it's because they're built on Jesus's methodology. They're the same pillars that the USCCB is using for the National Eucharistic Revival, actually. And so we're all, as a church, recovering this understanding of the focus of Jesus in the person of catechesis. And I think that's incredibly important for us.
Mm. If I could go back just a minute to what you started with there, just to emphasize it. I'm so glad you mentioned grief, because grief is a loss of something meaningful to us. And when we make a change and people are upset about it and hurt and angry, it's easy for us to think, oh, they just don't get it. Oh, they're just old school. Oh, they just, instead of taking a moment first to say they're upset and hurt because there's a loss happening for them here that's meaningful that we need to honor. And I think that's the first and most important thing, to honor the time that they have served, honor what they have given and sacrificed, and honor what's meaningful to them, and then begin to guide them in a place of helping them understand we don't we're not trying to change what you do, we're just talking about how you do it, and we're talking about what we all want, which is people to have a vibrant faith. And you want that too, don't you? And I'm sure they would say yes. So I think that's really important. To as we get closer to the end here, there's one thing I want to be sure we don't miss. And we have a bunch of questions, which maybe we'll run over a few minutes if you guys have the time. You talk about a change in how things were in the home space previously and where they're at now. And this is one of my favorite topics because I just have friends that are in this world that I want to see loved and cared for well. And what I mean is I have friends that are cradle Catholics that are no longer affiliated with the church personally, but yet they're sending their kids to Catholic schools. They're putting their kids through the sacraments. And I ask them why, and they don't even really know. Oh, it's just, it was good for me. And I say, well, you don't want to do it now. Why would you want to put your kids through it if it's not something that you want to do? And they don't really know how to answer that question, but many of them are there in our parishes, or at least their kids are. And then we go tell that person, you are your child's primary catechist. And they go, I don't even know what I believe. Are you kidding me? So in the midst of this new vision, and there are so many parents like this that we're encountering, how can we love them well and help them rather than just get annoyed that they just drop off their kids and go to Starbucks or go to yoga? I know we like to disparage that, but our next question needs to be, why do they do that? And how can I meet them where they're at in their journey? What would be your suggestion on that?
I think the number one thing that I always say, and I think the church is moving this way. I think there's a lot more that we can do in this area, but family begins at marriage. I think that's the number one thing, and we don't really accompany people well beyond marriage and baptism. And so I think the most important thing as a church that we could do right now is if we created some type of communal life and access to the liturgical life through post marriage and then post the wedding and then right after baptism, where we can dive into the messiness of what it means to merge our lives together and begin to live a life of faith with a spouse. Because you want to build the skills of how to live faith with your partner before those kids start coming into the picture. Like, how do you pray with each other? How do you take this time to infuse faith into your home, even before kids are there? But then also in the practical things, like how are we in the messiness of communication, the intimacy? We have the beauty of an agape type intimacy that we can connect them to, but how do we show them what true intimacy looks like? So I think there's a ways to accompany marriages, but then also in new family, when they start having kids, like how are we engaging them in this new experience besides just the baptismal class that they're going to? Like, how do we build that relationship, put them into community with other young families, and then journey with those communities into the lived parish experience? I think those two things are crucial to what we're doing, because what we are doing right now is we're waiting until they're 5, 6 years old, and then when they come to us, not only do they not know, we're then saying, like, this is the most important community for you. But we weren't involved in the most messiness part of family life, the creation of the family itself, and then supporting through some of those hardships that are there. Like, we know that there's a 25% divorce rate in those first 5 years of marriage. And so how do we get in there and give the tools and the skills that are there? And so I think it's key to meet them in that human experience, and then show them that the church is a community of faith that's there at the beginning of family life. And so I would say that's one of the key area.
I also want to I want to point out this. First of all, I love that we have laymen and women, sisters, pastors, deacons, everybody together. when we default to this is the issue for the director of catechesis or evangelization, and instead of what you're talking about, Dr. Stephen, which is this is about the creation of a culture of evangelizing catechesis, I think we're on thin ice. So if you find yourself the lone DRE out there in a rural parish where your only other staff member is a secretary or an administrative assistant, what I want to do is I want to encourage you to think team-based approach for this, because I think from a strategic perspective, we focus on what we can do in that specific ministry without looking at the full culture of the parish and asking ourselves things like, for example, the McGrath Institute study that was commissioned on Eucharistic belief and practices for the National Eucharistic Revival indicated 3 sacraments that were extremely important in the life of Catholics. And people were very surprised. As you would expect, Eucharist came up. 66% of Catholics said it was very meaningful for them. However, marriage was listed at 69% and baptism at 71%. So baptism, marriage, Eucharist, key moments for families. The other point of encouragement is that 71% of all Catholics today pray. This is good news, because then you have to ask, who are they praying to? What are they praying for? So if we can look at a more holistic understanding of new models that walk with families from an earlier age, and I know we're all very passionate about this, and teach families to pray, make these experiences of baptism, marriage prep much more meaningful and prayerful, that is going to be infused into the faith formation process, which I think we have to really look at, as well as not just the 1 hour a week, but what are all the opportunities that we have touch points in our parish to create these meaningful opportunities for engagement. And then the other thing I would say is your catechists have to be people of prayer. Like we talk about some of these things and we focus on what resources we're going to change and books and materials, but we often neglect the care of the person. And so praying with your catechist, praying for your catechist, being with them, encouraging them to have community together. Those are all ways that you can model that for families and then bring them into that circle of influence. And so those cultures can be created organically in small pockets. And then disciples will emerge from those conversations. And lo and behold, you will not have a catechist shortage. Like my friend, who's a great catechetical leader, she builds small faith sharing communities with the express purpose of helping people find what God is calling them to. And one of those ministries is the ministry of walking with families.
Wow, we have so much interaction on this conversation. Our Q&A is blowing up, and I love it. And I just wanted those of you to know that if your questions haven't been answered on here, these are being recorded, and we will respond to you if you attached your name to it. We'll respond to you after. One thing I do want to point out that was mentioned here, and it kind of goes back to the original question of what about parents who are disaffiliated or disconnected. There's another group that I think often feels very isolated or even judged here, and that's single parents. And I just want you to, in your communication with your parish about religious education, family faith formation, I always want you to be sensitive towards those people listening who are doing this on their own. If you have a meeting and you say, well, only one parent has to attend, or one parent can stay with the kids while another parent comes to the meeting, you're telling single parents that they're not welcome, they're not valued, they don't exist. So I would say if you can spend the money to provide childcare for any of those meetings, you're telling them we value you being a part of this process. We want to help you carry that burden. And I would even just call it out and just honor them and say, those of you that are single parents doing this on your own, you are champions. We love you. We're so grateful to have you here. They need to hear that, because if they don't hear it, their assumption is kind of the opposite. As we're running out of time here, both of you have resources that your organizations have created to help accompany parishes in this process. And both of your companies have gratefully offered a discount. And so if you could both just tell us about your resource, what the discount is, and those of you listening, in the email that goes out after this, you'll get a link in the discount code as well.
I'll go first. So, Developing Disciples of Christ is a book that I wrote to bring this conversation together between evangelization and catechesis. And Loyola Press is giving 30% off that particular book. If you're not in faith formation ministry, but you're more on the pastoral team side and you're looking at how to have this conversation on a bigger level, my book, Start with Jesus, is a great place to start with. And there's a code for that. What I want to mention, though, is there's a whole suite of resources that go with both of those books online that you can download. So when you're talking about personal evangelization, like how do I actually accompany someone? What are the steps of asking somebody into this kind of relationship? There's worksheets that go along with that, which are free that you can have and use in your parish or your school.
And we have a document called Mission Field. It's normally the starting document that we encourage pastors, PCLs, or diocesan leaders to utilize, which really helps create some collaborative conversations around moving faith formation structures to this new model, to like a more catechumenal approach. It really dives into this idea of the who and sort of the how we're participating in these things. And so we find it to be a really helpful tool to really spark conversations with catechists, with pastors, especially pastors and PCLs, to really get people on the same vision. What we find that the two main things that we find is that the pastor and the PCL need to be on the same page as you move forward into this approach. And then what Julianne said is this team dynamic. Like gone are the days of one person having to try to, or they're still there, but we can't keep continuing with one PCL having like 80,000 hats. The goal is most of it will be volunteer based, but how do you recruit these volunteers and create a team to serve these different areas? And it's going to start small. It's going to start very small, but Jesus started small. He had his 12, but he also intentionally only worked with 3. So even if you can only find 3 people and intentionally invest in those 3 people and see what God's calling them to do, and then put them into mission, or help them engage in mission, it'll be a game changer. So hopefully that'll be a helpful resource for you guys. And then that sort of is an on-ramp to the whole suite that we have at the Pathways Mission Suite.
Yeah, I know, Lynn Gass, I see your question about for Dr. Stephen about the family faith formation. We'll pass that on to him as well. Well, if I could throw my hat in the ring here on accompanying people, Great Catholic Parishes offers a couple things that might be helpful to you. One is I do on-site workshops where I come to your parish for like a Saturday, and we invite all your ministry leaders, or it can be a specific area like this. And we just spend a day that's interactive of teaching about accompaniment, having them practice it with each other, really helping them process it and ask questions, and forming strategic plans or next steps for this in your parish. We offer a lot of different workshops, but if you're wondering, like, how can I bring this to my parish? And I'd like to get a big group of people together to hear this and experience it and process it, I'd love to help you do that. The other thing that we do is cohorts, and that's where 8 to 10 parish pastors and their leadership teams come together, and we meet for a couple of days on all of this, and you really work through some practical things of what are we going to do in our parish, and create 6-month, 1-year, 18-month plans. And then we get together 4 times as a cohort over 18 months and learn and revise and collaborate and learn from each other. That's more of a diocesan-based thing. So if you're watching this and you're from a diocese, I'd love to talk to you about that. And I want to say just thank you to our guests. You guys are amazing. We all love and appreciate you. But thank you to everyone on this webinar. It is so encouraging to see so many people around the country, around the world, that are excited about this. And, you know, some people think that the church is dying and it's a ship going down. And I would say I feel a tide rising. I feel a momentum happening in this area that is really, really exciting. As we wrap up, would each of you just give a word of encouragement to those watching that are just seeking hope and support in this desire to help people grow in their faith?
Yeah, I really want to thank everybody who's here today for engaging in the conversation and recognizing that there was a lot of questions shared, because it's in the practicalities of where this is lived out. There's no one size fits all model. What I want to encourage you is to think of this as less like baking a cake with the right recipe and the right ingredients and more like a stew. Like every mom from every culture and dad opens their fridge and looks at all the things that they have in there and can pull a meal together. You can do this. The same God that called the disciples to shape the world and evangelize for him is the same God that calls you. The Holy Spirit is with us. Lean into this moment. And I feel that that excitement that you have in your heart will catch fire with this vision. And the emphasis on being in the home, so important today, but also bringing people into the parish community too, so that we don't lose that emphasis.
Yeah, and just to echo that, the Holy Spirit is very active right now in the church. I feel like it's inspiring people all over to think of what we talk about, this new ardor, this new like excitement for the faith, and I see it all over the place. And there's new creativity happening. Publishers are trying to come at it from different avenues. So there's so much hope, I feel, that is there. There's one line, it's a little bit long, so I'm just going to read it real quick for you, but it's from the Catechumenal Pathways for Married Life, and it's Pope Francis's introduction to that thing, and that document. But there's one line in it that just, I think, it really inspires me. I have it in my office all the time, because I feel like the discouragement, or when we try something and it doesn't work, we can immediately sort of get to give up and be like, oh, I don't know if this is going to work. But the church is asking us to keep trying, keep pushing forward, and keep trying to to inspire and to implement these new ways. But this new line that Francis has, he says, he uses from Acts. He says, I do not at all shrink from telling you what was for your benefit or for teaching you. I urge all of those who offer pastoral care to families to make these words of the Apostle Paul their own, to not be discouraged in the face of responsibility, which may seem difficult, challenging, even beyond our means. Be courageous. Let us begin to take the first steps. Let us initiate a process of pastoral renewal. Let us put our minds and hearts at the service of future families. I assure you that the Lord will sustain us, give us wisdom and strength, make our enthusiasm grow, and above all, allow us to experience the delightful and comforting joy of evangelizing as we proclaim the gospel of the family to new generations. I can't say it better than that. So
great to end on. Thank you, Dr. Stephen. Thank you, Julianne. And, in the comments, I'm getting several encore, when is part 2 of this? So we'll have to talk offline and see about that. But I think we have a lot more to discuss as well. So thank you both. Thank you, everybody, for joining. God bless you. We'll see you next month.